Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session about building stronger foundations in ArcGIS Pro. This is part of our customer webinar series for 2023. I'm Dave Tong. I'm a principal GIS consultant in the pre-sales team here at Edge UK, and my role is to support our customers in understanding how to make the most of their technology. And I'm joined by my colleague, Scott.
Hi everyone, I'm Scott and I'm on the graduate programme at Esri UK and I'm currently working with Dave in the pre-sales team.
Great, thanks Scott. So a little bit of housekeeping before we get going with the actual webinar is this webinar is being recorded, so we're aware that not everyone who wanted to has been able to join this session, but don't worry, we will provide a link to the webinar in a follow-up email, but also be putting it up on our website so it will be accessible to everyone. That follow-up email will also include a variety of resources, some of which we'll touch on today. The hope is those will help you get up and running with Pro. We'll do a Q&A at the end, so if you have any questions, please do submit them at any time through Slido. The event details are down at the bottom there, and we'll try and cover as many as we can at the end. We'll also be doing a few polls through Slido. We're really interested in your thoughts on how we can improve this program, so please do reach out because that feedback is great. Now, me and Scott use Pro every day. It's a big part of our daily activities. So our aspirations today are to help you understand how to make the most of Pro, how we can share as much information with you about little tips and tricks that we use to be efficient in our use of the technology. So I'm going to start off talking a little bit about the interface and how I configure and set that up to make my projects easy to use. And then I'm going to finish up with a demo that shows how we can create a simple map and run some analysis, because we do want to touch on the foundation concepts as well. I'm then going to hand over to Scott, and he's going to move on from those basics to talk about some slightly more advanced topics. And then he'll finish up with a demo about how you can load a messy data set, because that comes up all the time in our line of work. So let's go over to Pro now. And before we actually look at my project, I want to highlight one thing on this opening new project page. So as soon as you open Pro, you'll be presented with this view. And this is where we can start creating a new project. But if I click the Learning Resources tab, there's a wealth of information here that helps you get started. So if you're a new user, there's tutorials, quick start guides. If you're an existing user, there's tips and tricks on the latest capability and new functionality. It's also worth noting there's a ArcMap users specific section here. So those people that are thinking of migrating to Pro, this is a really good resource to help you get up and running quickly. Now, the project I'm going to use today is this one. Don't worry too much about the data at the moment. We're going to touch on that a little bit later. But for now, I just want to use it to talk you through the way I set up my interface, because configuring the display is a big part of efficiency in your use of Pro. Now, all of these windows are set up in a very specific way towards the way I work, but they are all configurable. So I can take any of these windows, I can move it around in the display, I can pin it, I can close it, I can choose what I want to be seen. So please do set up your project so it remembers the way you want to work. Now let's do a quick tour around the interface, and I'm going to start off with the table of contents. Now, lots of people would look at the table of contents and think, well, Dave, surely that's just for turning layers on and off. And yes, that is its primary purpose, but there's so much more capability in here that quite often gets overlooked. So I can turn layers on and off. But I've also got the option through these other tabs to decide what layers are selectable. To ensure I'm selecting the right things, I can filter down to just those selectable layers. Similarly, I can also decide, well, what layers are editable. It's very easy to start editing the wrong things unless you've got it very well defined. I can also choose what layers I want to snap to and what layers are labeled. Finally, the tab I probably use the most is this data source tab. This helps me understand where all of my data is coming from. And that can be really useful if you're trying to keep your projects tidy. So you can see that I've got 3 data sets here. They're coming from 3 separate locations. Is that what I meant to do? or should everything be constrained to just one database? So it gives me a feel for where these things are coming from. Up along the top here, we've got most of the tools and commands you'll be using day to day to complete your activities. The one thing I want to highlight is this toolbar is adaptable. So when I've got the map, I'll get a certain number of toolbars available. When I choose a layer, I get the layer options coming up. So from within here, I've got the option of changing my scale thresholds, adjusting my transparency, changing symbology, looking at labeling, etc. So the UI will change depending on what you're selecting. Over on the right-hand side here, I've got 4 windows that I've got tabbed together because I use this capability all the time. So it's really useful for me to have them on display so I've got access to them whenever I might need. So the catalog pane is really useful for managing and maintaining your project. So I can see the number of maps that I've got within my project. So we can have as many maps in this project as we like. I've also got my toolboxes where I can create my own tools, which we'll touch on a little bit later. I've got the databases that I've either created or added into the project. By default, there'll always be one, but we can very easily create a new one. So if I say new file geodatabase, I quite often create a temporary geodatabase as part of my project so that when I'm doing any sort of temporary work or I'm testing out some analysis, I can write it through that temporary database, knowing that none of that information is important. I can delete it out at the end of the day. Anything I want to keep, I keep in my core foundations project. Now, to ensure that everything does get written there when I run analysis, I'm going to right click that and say I want to make that my default database. So when I do exports, when I run analysis, it will go here. Scott is going to touch on styles a little bit later. So the last thing I want to talk about here is folders. Now, by adding folder connections, I can connect to any folders that I use on a regular basis. So it might be that I've got an offline data store that I use regularly. It might be there's this shared server location where I collaborate with my colleagues. So add them all into your project so that they're readily available to you. Now, the catalog pane is not just used to access your local content. It can also be used to access content in your portal. So that might be ArcGIS Line or it might be ArcGIS Enterprise, because you'll notice at the top here that I'm signed into my police account because I do lots of work in public safety. And because I'm signed in, I've got access to all the materials within my portal environment. That might be stuff that I personally have created, or it might be things that have been shared with me. So I can very easily add feature services from the online environment by simply dragging them into the display. So in this case, I've just added a grid that we'll be using for analysis later, or I can even open entire web maps by right-clicking and saying add and open. And what that will do is that will bring in that web map as a reference data set into my project. And I can interact with this in exactly the same way I would online. So I can make symbology changes and I can do editing. I can also access the Living Atlas through my portal environment. So if there's data sets that you created by Esri UK or have been shared by our customers, you can bring them into your projects. The next tab I have readily available is symbology. We'll touch on this later, but I use this all the time. So why would I not have it open to me whenever I need it? Geoprocessing is another common area that I use, and I've configured this so some of my most popular tools are classified as favorites, which means they will always be there pinned at the top for me so I can readily access them. If I want to find a different tool, then I just search for it. So if we're looking for a buffer, then I start typing, it'll give me the results. I can hover over any of these. It will give me a feel for what that tool is going to achieve, and then I can open it up. So quick and easy to find tools rather than having to manually navigate through all the individual toolboxes. Finally, at the bottom here, I've got the history tab. Now, the history tab is great because it keeps a record of all the tools I've run as part of this project. Now, that's useful to remind myself of any previous processing I've done or analytics I've calculated, but it also means I can very easily rerun tools if I need to tweak the parameters. So it might be I'm running some analysis and I've got that parameter slightly wrong. I don't have to type it all in again. I can just open up the one that I last used, tweak the parameters and rerun it. So the history tool is really great. And it's also got the ability to help us create our own tools, which we're going to touch on in a moment. So that's a little bit of an overview of the way I set up the interface to make it as easy as possible for me to use. But this is a foundations session, so I do want to talk about how we create a new map from scratch to give you a feel for best practice with that process. So for that, I'm going to go over to my demo map here, which I haven't really done anything with. It just contains a base map. The data we're going to load is this crime spreadsheet. So this is a version of the crime data that's available online on the police data site. Now, for the purposes of the demo today, the key things are that we've got a long and a lat, and we've got a crime type that we can use for visualization. So that allows us to load the data with a location and then visualize it against crime type. Now, to load this data in, I'm going to go up to the Add Data button, and I'm going to choose XY point data. So I'm loading a spreadsheet with some XY points in, and I can convert that into a data set. That opens up a geoprocessing tool, so I can navigate to where that CSV is. I can choose a output name, so we'll call this Hearts Crime. It's picked up my long and lat automatically, so that's good. And the final thing I need to do is choose the coordinate system. Now, it's worth highlighting here, this is really, really important. If you're loading data from a spreadsheet and you find it ends up in totally the wrong place, there's a good chance you're using the wrong coordinate system. So I know that my spreadsheet is using global coordinates. So therefore, I need to reference a global coordinate system. Many of you are probably using British National Grid data, so please do choose the right coordinate system. The other thing that can quite often go wrong is get the long and the lat the wrong way around. So those are three common mistakes for loading data. So I'm going to run that and it will add the data to my display, give it some default symbology and zoom me down to the right area. Now at the moment I can see where all these crimes are. I can click on any of these points and it's going to return all that rich information that we had in the spreadsheet. Now, because we've got the crime type data in here, I can use that for symbology. So I'm going to go to my symbology tab, and rather than a single symbol, we're going to use unique values. And the unique values are going to be based on that crime type. Now, it's given me a default color scheme that I'm not overly happy with. It's a little bit light in color, but I can easily change that using any of these color ramps. So I'm going to scroll down to find one I think appropriate. I'm going to use the enamel color ramp because I think it's got some nice bold colors that stand out. So now we can see the distribution of crime across this area, but I think it's fair to say that it's still fairly unclear where the hotspots are, what the dominant crime types are. So by going up to my feature layer options at the top here, I can turn on some aggregation, and more specifically, I can turn on clustering. This is a really great tool to aggregate my data together on the fly so I can understand, well, where are my hotspots? And also, more importantly, what's the dominant crime type in that area? So for this area at the bottom, we can see that there's 1,412 crimes that have been aggregated together in that particular location. And the blue is showing that most crime in that area is violence and sexual offences. This aggregation is really cool because it's also dynamic. So as I zoom in, it would give me more and more information about where those hotspots are. I can also adjust the clustering tolerance. So if I want a slightly lower radius, I can easily change that, and that will give me a wider variety of hotspots. So what we've done is we've loaded some data and we've visualized it appropriately. This is a really nice first step of understanding our data better. We've not run any analysis. All we've done is visualize it appropriately. What I want to do now, though, is I actually want to show you some analysis. So I'm going to add in another data set. So I want to create a thematic map. So I'm going to load in a grid data set, and we're going to aggregate our crime to this grid and then visualize it based on the count to create a thematic map. So for that, I'm going to run a geoprocessing task. We're going to run the spatial join between the crime data and the grid. We'll call this crime count. I'm going to run that. I'm going to turn off my other data while that loads in. You can see that's already added it in, and I can click on any of these locations and we can see that we've got this new join count field. So I can use that to visualize that data set, perhaps with a graduated color against the join count, and adjust the color ramp to something that's a little bit easier on the eye. So really quick process to load some data in, do some visualization, and run some analysis. When I go back to my history tab, I can see the two tools that I've just run. Now, if this is something that I want to run on a regular basis, I can automate that using geoprocessing models. To do that, I go back to my catalog, go to my toolbox, right-click this and say, let's create a new model. And by default, it will start off blank. But I can go to my history, I can take those tools that we've just run, drag them into the model, and it understands that they work together. So it's connected them all up. So we've got the CSV that was turned into a point data set, joined to my grid to create an output crime count. Now I can make this a little bit more interactive at runtime by making some of these parameters. So what that means is I will be requested to choose the CSV, to choose the boundary, and to choose the output, because it might be I want to change it. I can also change the symbology that will be used. So this crime count, I want to come through with a very defined symbol set. So I'm going to choose a layer file that I already have on disk. So I'm now going to save that. We don't need the model anymore. I'm going to remove the two data sets we've just created. But I can go back to my model we've just created. I can double click that. You can see that it's prompting me for the CSV, the boundary data, and the output name. So I could adjust this to choose a different data set if I so wish. But when I run that, it's going to load the data, do the join, and then visualize it all in one step. So geoprocessing models are great if you've got repetitive tasks, things you do all the time that you want to automate for ease of use. So hopefully you found that initial overview really interesting. Hopefully it's covered off some of the foundations. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Scott, who's going to talk you through a few more advanced topics.
Thanks, Dave. So there we've seen some of the basics for setting up your project for success in Pro. I'm now going to talk about how we can take those basics a step further. So in this section, I'm going to touch on how we can manage those projects that have a large number of data sets using catalog layers. I'm going to share some symbology tips and tricks. I'm going to talk about how we can complete workflows using tasks, and then I'll finish out by loading in and tidying up a messy data set and then bringing that data into a layout. So I'll just jump back into Pro. And I'm starting off with this very busy looking map where I've just added in a whole collection of different data sets. If I go to my data source, I can see that these data sets are coming from a variety of different portal locations and a bunch of local geodatabases. So traditionally, I might try and tidy up my catalog, my contents pane and my map using something like group layers. But I want to show you how we can do this using catalog layers. So I'm going to move over to this second map where I have all of those same data sets, but they're organized into this single catalog layer. I have two aspects of this catalog that allow me to explore my data with a sort of generalized view. Firstly, I have this footprints. It shows the spatial area that each of my layers occupies in the map without showing me all of that contrasting symbology. I can open up the attribute table and I can view the item source for each of my layers, and I can understand whether it's a hosted feature service or a local feature class. I've also got this layers in view group, which is really useful because it is filtered by my current map extent. So if I zoom down to the south, you'll see that my layers in view group updates. If I then move up to the north, you'll see that it will update again to show me what data is currently in my view. So this is a really nice way of managing those projects and understanding what data you have and where that data is. Once I've identified which data I might be interested in, I can then toggle that layer on as normal. And if I want to work with it in more detail, I can make a copy of the layer, turn off my catalog, and begin some analysis. So moving on to symbology, Dave touched on this, but I want to talk about how we can begin to build up some more complex and interesting symbology in our maps. And I'm going to do this talking about this polygon layer that I have here. So I'm going to open up my symbology tab. You'll notice that I have this docked to the left-hand side. I find it quite useful to have this here when I am working with symbology changes quite regularly. If I go into the properties of my symbology and I go to my appearance tab, I can start making some basic changes to the default appearance that's been applied by Pro. So I can go in and change the outline color of this polygon to an orange. I'm actually going to change the fill color to be the same. I can apply that and see that it's been added to my map, but maybe I want to make this symbology a little bit more interesting. So I can go into the layers tab for this symbology and understand the different components that are contributing. So here I have a solid stroke layer, that's my outline, and I have a solid fill layer, which is my interior. And what I can do with these drop downs is start to tweak individual components of these layers. So in this case, I'm going to change the solid fill to a hatched fill. I can apply that and see it updated on my map. If I want to update that to make it look a little nicer, I can do things like change the line width or increase the separation of the lines to make something I'm a bit more happy with. I can go and do the same thing with my stroke layer. And now I have some symbology that I think marks out my zone a little nicer. If I want to take this a step further, I can go into my structure tab. In here, I can see that I have my two existing symbology layers, but I can also go and add another one. So here I'll add an extra fill layer and I'll drag it to the bottom of my drawing order and apply that. And now you can see that the gaps between the lines have been filled in. So this is great, and I'm quite happy with how my symbology looks, but maybe I want to reuse this on a different layer. So I'm going to use my bookmarks to zoom to a different area of this map. Here I have another layer, which contains another zone. Now I could go into my symbology and I could start rebuilding that symbology that I've just created from the ground up, or I could run a tool that will do it for me. So if I close my symbology pane and I'll open up geoprocessing, I'm going to search for apply symbology. And I'm going to use this tool called apply symbology from layer. All I need to do here is specify the layer that I'm going to be applying to and the layer that I'm applying from, and click run. And you'll see that my new layer has had its symbology updated based on a different layer. So this is a really great way to use your to reuse your symbology within a project. But what if you want to reuse your symbology in another project, or you want to share that symbology with a colleague? Well, that's where styles come in. So Dave touched on styles. They have their own dedicated section within your catalog. And you'll notice that there's a few different groups here. We've got favorites, we've got a few default ones, and there's also some extra custom ones that I've added. Now, styles kind of work like any other database item in ArcGIS Pro, but they're specifically for containing symbology, color palettes, labels, and anything that you use to visualize your data. You can add styles to your project like you would with any other database, simply by going into add. And here I've set up a collection of different styles that I regularly add to my projects. To show you how I would save styles, I'll go into my symbology pane, and you'll notice I have this little menu up here. All I need to do is press save symbol to style. And here I'm just going to call this test2. I'm going to save it to my favorite style. Favorites is great because it persists across all of your projects by default. So now that I've saved that style, I'm going to go to my third map bookmark. And here you can see I have a whole collection of different zones that I want to visualize. So we'll go to my first zone category. And if I go to my gallery, you can see that I have a whole collection of styles here. So test2, that's the symbology that I just created. If I click on that, it'll apply it to my first category. So this is great. I love saving things to my favorites, but it does get quite messy. So what I have done since is kind of create these different styles that have different themes. So here you can see I've got a collection of borders. I've got some more artistic symbologies. I've got some that are for land use, but I also have some for zones. So what I'm going to do now is apply these zone symbologies to a couple of these layers. But as I mentioned, styles aren't just for symbology files, they're also for really basic foundational things like a color palette. So for these last three categories, I'm simply just going to change the fill color, and I can do that by right-clicking on them in the contents. So you'll see here, I've opened up and I've got the kind of the default ArcGIS color palette, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, but I've also got this extra group for transparent colors, which is a style that I've created by myself. I find that I work with symbology quite a lot, transparency in my symbology quite a lot, but I find the process of applying transparency to be quite tedious. So I created this style, and as you can see, I can go in and apply some transparent symbology to my layers, nice and easy. In terms of how we can share and reuse these styles, there's two ways to do that. We can go into our catalog, we can right click on any of our styles and manage them, understand where they're stored, and this stylex file we can send to our colleagues directly or upload it to a network location. Or alternatively, we can go to the Share tab, go to Web Style, and we can publish any of our styles as a web style to our portal. Going to move on again. And so Dave introduced you to a way that we can chain sets of tools together to complete workflows that have multiple steps by creating those models. I now want to talk about tasks, which allow you to do something similar, but with a little bit more guidance. They're really useful for instructing new users and help you to complete workflows that you might not be familiar with. And I think the easiest way to show how to use a style is to go through one. So I'm going to open up this style that I've created here, and you'll see that it's for georeferencing a site plan. If you're not sure what georeferencing is, it's the process of adding spatial information to an image so that you can view it in context on a map. And as you'll notice in this style panel that I've opened, I've been presented with a few different steps that I'll need to complete in order to do my georeferencing. My first step is to zoom to an area of interest. I've already set up a bookmark for this. So I can then press next to proceed to step 2. This tells me I need to add a site plan. So I'll go ahead and select the image that I'm going to be georeferencing. I'm then told that I need to open up my georeferencing menu. If I'm not sure where this is, I'm given some instructions to help me find it. I've done that, and then the next few steps are going to tell me about a few settings that I need to apply. I then come on to this optional step of the task, which I can complete because it will make my life a little bit easier. This is all about moving and resizing the image before I start adding my control points. Once I'm happy with the size of my image, I can go in and I'm told that I now need to add some control points. I'm told that I need to add at least 2. If I'm not too sure what to do here, I'm given all the context I need within the task. So I'll add in 3 control points just to be safe. And I'll go next. This will then apply the transformation, and I can then review my results. The task tells me that if I'm not happy, I can go back and I can add some more control points. And as you can see, I haven't been too successful here, so I will go and do that. Let's add another control point here. You'll then see that my transformation is reapplied, and I'm much happier with the result this time. So as a first-time user, this task has allowed me to complete my georeferencing without me having any prior knowledge of what I'm doing. But tasks aren't just great for helping users understand what they're doing. You can also author your tasks to help automate a process. So if I remove this image and I go back to my tasks, I'm going to go into a second version of this task. This one, I've set up related actions for each of my steps, and this will allow me to automate much of the process. So you'll notice this time I'm going to add in my image, and the next 3 or 4 steps are going to be auto-completed for me. So it opens up all of the right menus and it sets all of my settings correctly. This means I can really quickly go in and just start doing the steps that actually require my attention. Once again, I'll go in and add all of my control points. And just like that, I've completed my task. So you can imagine if I'm doing something like this on a day-to-day basis, it's really going to speed up my workflows. And like I said, tasks can kind of be configured to do anything in Pro, and you can author them and share them just like you will any other layout or any other item within Pro. So you can see that I have this tasks group within my catalog, and I can also go to the Share tab and share my tasks from here as well. I'm going to move on to the last section of this demo. Dave showed you a really nice example of how we can bring in data and start visualizing and analyzing it. But I'm sure a lot of you know that when you're working with GIS data, it's not always in a ready-to-use format, and you often need to do a bit of tidying up before you can get started. So here I have a CSV that contains some supermarkets. I have the names and I have the types of the supermarkets. I have some fictional values around the estimated revenue and the number of households that are within a 10-minute drive of each of my stores. And before I bring this data in and start to display it spatially, I want to learn a little bit more about it. So I'll go into my data engineering group, which tells me that I can explore, visualize, and prepare my data. In this view of the data, I can start looking at some summary statistics for each field. So I can do really basic things like look at the name field, and I can see that I have 16 unique values, which is good. It means I don't have any repeated names. I can look at the type field, and I can see that I have 2 types of stores. I have mega stores and I have local stores, and mega stores are the most common type. But then I can look at the stats that I'm more interested in. So for my revenue, I can see that a high number of the revenue values are on the left-hand side, but I seem to have one on the far right over here as well. If I scroll to the right, I can see that an outlier has been identified for this field. So I need to keep this in mind before I do any analysis. If I come back over to the left, I can look at my latitude and longitude fields, and I can see that unfortunately I've got a few null values here. So if I wanted to try and display this data using the X and Y method that Dave showed previously, I'm not going to be able to display all of my values. However, if I look at my postcodes, I can see that I do have 16 unique values. So this is probably a better way to load in my data. So in that case, I'm going to geocode my table. So if I go to my geocode tool, all I need to do is input my table and specify the locator that's going to convert my address information into points on a map. Now I could use the World Geocoding Service, which is really great for that kind of building level detail. But because I only have postcode information, I'm going to use the OS Code Point Open Locator. This is provided by Esri UK, and it has a great benefit of not costing you any credits. So all I need to do is tell the tool which field contains my postcode information, and then I can run my tool. I can see that I've had 16 match addresses on my first attempt, so there's no need to do any rematches. And my data is now being loaded in. What I can start to do now is go back to my attribute table, and you'll notice that a whole collection of additional fields have been added as a result of the geocoding. Because I'm not particularly interested in these fields, I can go into my fields view, and I can select all of these additional fields and turn them off. If I save that and go back to my attribute table, you'll see that I now just have the fields that I care about. Now what I want to do here is identify that outlier value that I had in my revenue field. So I'm going to sort my data, scroll to the bottom, and I can see this unusually large value. In this case, it's just a case that I've added too many zeros to the number. So I can go in and correct that and make sure to save my edit. And now I can start generating some insights for this data. So to do that, I'm going to create a new field that is based on the revenue per household. So I'll go back to my fields view, and I'll create a new field called revenue per household. Make sure that I get the data type right, and then save that. Now you can see that I've got this new field here. At the moment, there's no data, so let's go ahead and calculate the data. Here you can see that all I need to do is put in my revenue field and then divide that by the number of households. I can then make sure the expression is valid, calculate that, and you can see I now have my values. They're not in the best format, so what I'll do is I'll go back to my fields view for a final time. I'll change the number format from numeric to currency. Once I've done that, I can see that all of my field values are now in a more familiar format. Now that I've done that analysis, I can go ahead and bring that data into a new map where I can do some symbolization and some further analysis to view my data. So here I've just symbolized those stores based on size and color for the revenue per household. Once I'm happy with my insights, I can add that into a layout ready to export either to the web or to print. So here I just have a layout where I have my map and I have some data-driven elements. So I have some charts and some tables that tell me more about the data. Now, what's really nice with layouts is they're fairly adaptable once you spent the time to configure them. So here I've set up this layout in an A4 landscape format, but if I want to change that, I can go into my properties. I can change the page size to something like A3, and as long as I have this resize box ticked, then everything will be resized for me. So here you can see Pro's now updated my display, and most of everything has been kind of resized appropriately. I might need to do some light editing with my table, but for the most part, I'm not starting from scratch. Another really nice thing that you can do with layouts is use them as templates for future projects to save time. The way that you do this is sharing it as a layout file, which you can do here. The best way that I find to do this personally is to create a copy of a layout that I'm happy with, bring it in as a separate layout, and then disconnect all of the elements. So here you can see the boxes are all empty because they're no longer connected to a map. I can then share this layout file and bring it into a new project with a different map that has a similar data source. And then all I need to do is select that element and connect it to a new map. So in this case, I'll connect it to a map for supermarket locations near Southampton. You can see that most of my elements have updated, and all I need to do, again, is some light editing to make sure that my new data set is displayed appropriately. And there you have it. So as layouts are kind of the natural end of a map's lifecycle, that kind of brings me to the end of our demos for today. So I'd just like to thank you for taking the time to join us. I hope that you found this session useful. In terms of what we've got upcoming, next week we have our Scottish conference, so I'm sure we'll be seeing some of you there. And our next webinar is on the 11th of October, and it's covering some of the reporting capabilities in the ArcGIS system. We're going to spend the last few minutes going on a Q&A, so I'll hand back over to Dave.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks everyone for joining us today. There's not been a massive number of questions, so if you've got anything that's in your mind at the moment, then please do submit it through. But what we'll do is we'll take this time to cover off a few that have come in already. So one of the questions was when you schedule a module. So I didn't actually discuss that, but geoprocessing models can be scheduled, so you don't have to run them then and there. You can, through the Pro interface, decide that you want to schedule them. And that schedule process uses Windows Task Scheduler. So that means it provides a little bit of additional capability, such as the ability to wake your machine up if it's gone to sleep, to run only when it's connected to power, to email you notification when the task completes. So there's quite a lot of options there, but your machine does need to be on. Next question is, someone asked whether we could confirm the version of Pro. Then it is 3.1.3. So me and Scott try and stay on the latest version wherever possible. So that's the version we're sharing today. We've had a question about bookmarking the recording. So that's actually quite a good shout, because we don't normally bookmark our sessions. But what I'll try and do is, once it's up on YouTube, I'll add a comment to the video so that it has a few key points in it, so you can jump quickly to the locations you want to go to.
I saw a question about geocoding. That is included within Pro. In terms of the credit use, it just depends on which locator you're using to convert those addresses. So if we use the World Geocoding service, that's provided by Esri. So that does cost credits to use. But if you configure your own locator, or if you use one of the free ones that's provided by Esri UK, then there's no additional cost to you.
Great. We've had a question about whether the recording is going to be shared. So yes, we will be sharing this by email to the people that registered. We'll also post it on our website so that everyone can access it, because we do appreciate that some people haven't been able to join today, so we want to make sure it is out there. There's a question about file geodatabases versus saving everything in a folder. So if you're saving directly to a folder, you're using shapefiles. Now, shapefiles are fine, but it's very old technology. So we would we'd recommend that people use file geodatabases wherever possible, because that gives you a really nice database format that's quick and will work really nicely with Pro. Now, you can have multiple file geodatabases. So as I mentioned in the demo, I quite often break things up. So it might be that I've got multiple file geodatabases for different elements of my project. So that's a good way of keeping everything apart. How do users know whether tools or data will cost credits? So when you run a tool, so most tools in Pro will not cost credits. So the only time you're going to use up credits is if you're starting to access the services that are online. So Scott mentioned if you use the World Geocoder, that will use credits. If you use any of the online analytical tools, those will use credits. And Pro will actually prompt you. It will say, look, there's a credit cost here. Can you just check that you're happy with that before progressing?
We've got a question about setting up windows and tools in Pro. You can save those as a layout file or a project file, I should say. That's something that we can share in terms of resources after the webinar, if that's useful to people. It means that you can, every time you start a new project in Pro, you can have it set up in a way that kind of works for you.
Let's go back to the top. Are all layers in portal environments in WGS84? How is this best managed in Pro if you're using OSGB? So that's a good question. So when you look at the base maps you've got available to you through Pro or through Online or Enterprise, you'll see that there's quite a wide range of different base maps. Anything that begins with GB is BNG data based on Ordnance Survey open data. So Esri UK take that open data, publish it as base map services for use by our customers. If it doesn't have GB in front of it, it means it's a global base map, and that will have a global coordinate system. So that's a quick way of working out, well, what is your base map coordinate system? And what we generally recommend is if you're using BNG data, it's generally best to use a BNG base map. If you're using global data, use a global base map. The other thing you want to check is that under the properties of your map, you have got a coordinate system that matches both the base map and the data, because it is quite easy to have a global coordinate system as defined in the map, but actually have a base map that is BNG, and then you'll see some slight slowdown. So if you see your base maps coming in quite slowly, there's a good chance you've got a mismatch between the coordinate systems, between the map properties, the base map, and the data.
We've got a question about symbology. Someone has asked, in ArcMap, you can symbolize using both color and size in the symbology tab. Can you do this in Pro? Yes, you can. The supermarkets map that I showed towards the end, it did show supermarket locations, and they were showing revenue using both color and size. The way that you do that is you apply your primary symbology first. So I normally do color as my primary symbology, and then you can go into the symbology tab, and there's a green icon that says vary symbology by attribute. In there, I normally then do a secondary symbology using the size. But again, we can kind of share some resources in a follow-up email if that helps.
And we've had a question about moving from ArcGIS Online to Pro. So assuming you're going to keep the ArcGIS Online system that will then support Pro, then any feature service or map that you've created online can simply be added to Pro. So you wouldn't necessarily need to recreate any of that collateral. If you do wish to have an offline copy, then you can right-click that feature service and say export to your file geodatabase. The thing you've got to consider there then is you've got a disjoint between, you've got a data set in online, you've got a data set in Pro. You've got to decide, okay, which of those is going to be my default database? Because otherwise you can start having people working on two different environments, and it can get a bit confusing. But certainly you can take things from online and bring them down into the Pro environment.
We've got a question about ensuring that layouts are accessible. There's two ways to do that. You can connect directly to a layout like you would a map or another geodatabase. So if you've created a layout in one project and you want to access it in another, all you need to know is the file path, and then you can connect to that layout. Or if you want to share a layout file that I talked about towards the end with a template, you can share that. I believe it's a PageX extension file, and you can just send that directly to colleagues or save that in a sort of common location that you're going to be accessing regularly.
We've had someone that's got quite excited by Task Tool, which is good to hear, asking whether there's any resources. So we will provide information about tasks as part of the follow-up email. There's also a question about are there any template tasks? Now, I'm not sure whether there are, but certainly if there were going to be some, they'd be under the task section in the Pro Online Help, because the online help is a great place to go for tutorials or guidance on any of the tools, and quite often there will be samples that you can run through. The other thing I'd recommend is look at learn.arcgis.com, because that also has detailed lessons that will include samples and data sets so that you can have a go about some of this yourselves. One person's picked up on my comment about shapefiles as old tech. The industry, the nice thing about shapefile is it's used by many different systems. So there are lots of different solutions outside of ArcGIS that can load shapefiles. So certainly from a ensuring we provide support to a wide variety of environments, then we're not looking to get rid of shapefiles, but they aren't, they're not a performant data set. So we would strongly recommend that people do move to file geodatabases or have a fully fledged enterprise geodatabase if they've got business data that needs to be used on a regular basis, or more importantly, if you're working with multi-user editing or you want lots of people accessing the data at the same time, then databases really are needed for that. We've got a question about catalog datasets working with SGE. So SGEs effectively are database environment. So Scott showed the fact that you can use catalog datasets coming from a variety of different sources. So that will all be fine from that perspective. What's the best way of collaborative working in Pro? So if you've got multiple users, so you can have collaboration, so you can work on a multi-user environment. The limitation there is that if you've got, there's 3 different license levels of Pro. So you've got Pro Basic, which is designed to be used by yourself with local data sets. You've got Pro Standard, which allows you to access multi-user editing environments. So that's what we'd recommend if you wanted to do collaborative working. You could have one central data store that everyone is accessing, and then Pro will provide you an environment to ensure that's kept in check. And then finally, we've got the advanced license level, which provides everything I've just discussed and a variety of more advanced tools. So hopefully that's an overview of the licensing level and how you can start addressing collaborative working. Is there a resource for familiarizing yourself with the free UK geocoding tools? So I believe on our website there's information about the various services that Esri UK provides. So that will be the base map services and the geocoding service that we provide. For anything global, so the World Geocoding Service, then it will just be part and parcel of either the ArcGIS Online or the ArcGIS Pro help that we referenced a little bit earlier on.
We've got a question about Pro styles and other additional styles available. There are. I'm not aware of one location you can go to for a whole library of styles, but what you can do is search ArcGIS Online for styles that you know have been published. A lot of users like to share their styles around, and a lot of our blog posts on cartography will often share out the style files that you can use afterwards. So I'd probably say have a look in ArcGIS Online, have a look in the Living Atlas and see what you can find in there.
Okay, we've got quite a popular question about wrapped text in an attribute box. I think in fairness, I don't actually know the answer to that. So I'll endeavor to look into that and so that we can perhaps reply as part of the follow-up email. Can we show more information about layouts? Then, yeah, so we'll provide some information about layouts as part of the resources email. But just to reiterate, the online help for Pro is amazing. If you've got any question about any of the specific areas we focused on today, that's a really good place to look first. But we will try and provide as many direct links to that resources to touch on the areas we've covered today.
I think one thing to note with the difference in layouts between ArcMap and Pro is that you can have multiple layouts that connect to one map in Pro, which I believe is not the case in ArcMap. So you can kind of have 2 or 3 different layouts in different sort of formats and with different elements within them, and they can all point to the same data source. That's one thing that I definitely struggled getting my head around with when I first started with Pro.
We've got a question about migrating shapefiles into a geodatabase format. So, well, the easiest way to do that is through the catalog window, and then you can select all the shapefiles you want to load and then just copy and paste them into the geodatabase. So then that will convert those shapefiles into a geodatabase format. So all fairly easy. Can we share a link to other webinars? Absolutely. So when we share the link, it will take you to our webinars page where you can see both the webinar that we've just covered, but also a variety of other webinars that we've talked through on previous occasions.
We've got a question about georeferencing. Is there a way to open an image to be georeferenced in another window? Personally, I'm not aware of a way to do this. It might be possible, but I've always just done it within my main map pane.
We have a question about migrating to a new computer, whether it be tasks, layouts, geoprocessing tools. Now, most of that is saved within the project itself. So if you back up your project, so whether that through OneDrive or some other process, then when you bring that back down to your machine, you'll still have access to the task, the layout, the geoprocessing tools. You'll also have access to your history because it's all saved within that project. So absolutely back up your projects and you should be fine. If a feature layer is published from Pro to ArcGIS Online in BNG, will it retain that? So yes, so when you're publishing from Pro, it will maintain the coordinate system that your map is currently in. So if you've created a really nice map using a British base map with British data, the whole thing's in BNG. When you publish that, it will stay in BNG in the online environment. So then the only consideration you need there is if you swap base maps to something global, you've obviously got a slight mismatch. So you need to be aware that there might be some performance, a performance hit. But for the most part, if you've got a small amount of data, that will all be fine. Just looking through.
Got a question about transferring custom styles from ArcMap to Pro. I believe that should be possible. I'm not sure. So I believe ArcMap used style files, but they were a dot style, whereas Pro is a dot style X. So there might be a way to convert from one to the other. I'm not aware of exactly how you do that right now, but it might be something that we can follow up in a reply in the Slido session if you keep that open for the rest of the day. And I should just note, if there are any questions that we don't manage to answer right now, we might be able to reply to a few of them if you keep your Slido window open for the rest of the day.
Okay, and then let's just do a final few. There's one question here about customizing the ribbon toolbars to suit user needs. So yeah, absolutely. So you can customize the toolbars at the top. I mentioned earlier that I work in the public safety space, so I've got an extension for crime analysis. I've got extensions for defense tools. Now, for the purposes today, I didn't want to show those because it just confuses the picture about what the standard UI is. So I just turn them off. So I can choose the menus that are available to me to simplify my user experience, or if there's extra things I want to add in that I would find incredibly useful, I can add those to the display as well. And one final question about formatting the data for lat and long values so that it will load it correctly. There's no specific rules about the number of decimal places that are required, but obviously the more decimal places you have, the more accurate that data will be. Particularly for lat and long, the decimal places are quite important. For BNG, not quite so much. So I would recommend trying to have a really good coordinates to get the best possible results. Obviously, it does depend on the accuracy you're looking for, because if you're working at postcode level, then you're not going to need quite as much detail as if you're trying to really get down to premise level. Any last ones from you, Scott? I'm just trying to go through a few that I can answer easily.
I think that might be it for now. Potentially we can follow up on a few of the remaining questions that are here in the Slido.
Okay, one last one. There was a question about whether we can share some of our files. Quite a lot of certainly the police data is available publicly online. So if you're just starting getting going with Pro and you just want a simple data set to play with, then downloading the police data for an area of interest for you is a really great place to start, because it downloads it in a CSV, it's ready to load straight away. And then a variety of boundary data sets to support that are available through the Living Atlas. So the Office for National Statistics have shared police boundaries. You can also get other boundary data sets through the Living Atlas. So that's a good place to start if you want some simple data sets. But I think for now, we'll leave it there. Hopefully we've covered most of the most important questions. Apologies if we haven't got round to everything, but there's still a few left. But thanks for joining us today. Thanks very much for coming to the session. And we do hope to see you either at one of our conferences that are coming up. So Scott mentioned that we've got the Scottish conference very soon. Welsh conference is in about a month's time. And we've got another webinar planned for next month. So hopefully see you all soon. Thanks very much.